No gravity, no atmosphere. An endless vacuum of radiation, dust, magnetic fields, and amazing celestial bodies. Where Earth ends and the universe begins. Space, the final frontier. Astrophysicist Dr. Susanna Randall is training to take on the stars.
The mission hasn't really changed from the beginning. The mission is to send the first female German astronaut into space. And it is actually quite interesting. I mean, I've always described myself as a feminist, so I've always been very much for equality and saying, you know, women should be equal to men and men should be doing more of this. But I never realized until I started with this program how extremely women are still being discriminated against in Germany in particular.
Susanna Randall has space in her soul and stars in her eyes. A scientist, she's fighting 21st century patriarchy so she can touch the sky. Susanna Randall wants to be the first German woman in space.
So I was always just fascinated by space. And I'm not sure why, because no one in my family is in the remotest interested in space. What I do remember is when I was about 8 or 9, and this is really a vivid memory. It's one of these memories I think that you make and then you repeat to yourself so many times that they become really ingrained in you. So I was sitting at our breakfast table and we get this newspaper, the Kölner Stadtanzeiger, and I remember seeing this really bad black and white photo in the newspaper, and it showed the surface of Phobos, and Phobos is one of the moons of Mars. And I just remember looking at this and I was like, wow, this spaceship has actually gone there and it's managed to take photos of the surface. And that was a moment for me when it just clicked. It's not only there, but we can also go there. And from that point on, I really became fascinated in earnest with space.
Susanna watches the SpaceX launch. Maybe one day she'll be on board.
I forgot the peanuts. They're good luck. It's customary at NASA mission control to always have a bowl of peanuts for good luck for the astronauts. 7, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I was never that good at maths or physics at school till really, really late. I mean, I was much more the artsy, musical, linguistic type, and those were the things that were encouraged and that I was good at as well. And actually, I had a bit of a dilemma because I was fascinated by space and I knew I wanted to do something with space, but I always thought I'm not good at maths or physics and that's just not going to happen for me. And that was really how I spent most of my youth. And then I got a lucky break in a way in 10th grade, so when I was about 16, I guess, 15 or 16, I had a really motivated physics teacher. And somehow, from like 1 week to the next, I went from being at best mediocre at physics to being really quite good because I was interested, because I was motivated to also give my best and to work at it. And all of a sudden I realized that these categories that people put you in, you know, you can't do this, but you're good at this and you're bad at that, they're just categories the other people want to make up. They're not necessarily a true reflection of your own abilities. A lot of people will say, oh, you've got a PhD, you must be so smart. I'm like, no, I've got a PhD because I'm pig-headed, because, you know, I bulldozed myself through this because I forced myself to stick at it, not because I'm so smart. I mean, it's really, and that's what a PhD does for you. It really, I think, forms your capacity to prevail against the odds.
Susanna has taken an unconventional path to become an astronaut. She's not connected to an international space agency like ESA, the European Space Agency. Rather, she's part of a private organization called Die Astronautin, which hopes to send Germany's first female astronaut into space. That's why she's kept her job at the European Southern Observatory. That means she's training alongside her full-time job.
So basically, in my position at ESO, my job is kind of split. I'm an ARC astronomer. ARC is the ALMA Regional Center. So ALMA is the telescope itself, the antennas that are in Chile, and we have this regional center in Garching. So my main job is supporting the other astronomers that are using ALMA in Europe. And then a bit decoupled from that is my own personal research. And then once or twice a year, I'll actually go to the telescope.
The European Southern Observatory, or ESO, sits 5,000 meters above sea level on the Chajnantor Plateau in the Chilean Andes.
That's part of my role for ALMA, and I will take observations again for other people. So ALMA is a telescope that is purely in service mode, which means that the people that want the observations don't actually travel themselves, but they have people like me that travel for them, that know the telescope, that know the technical details, that then execute the observations, make sure the data are okay, and then send them the data.
The ALMA telescope is part of one of the highest astronomical observatories in the world. This is one of the world's driest places, too.
Hola, buenas tardes. Yeah. Gracias.
At this altitude, Susanna has to carry oxygen for the drive.
This is kilómetro 21. Vehículo 21 al kilómetro 21 sin novedades.
From up here, the astronomers have an incomparable view of the stars. But the working conditions are tough.
Hola. Buenos días. Buenos días. Gracias. Manejando. Y ahora me siento como...
Susanna has to undergo a medical checkup when she reaches the top of the mountain. The observatory is so high up that Susanna's blood oxygen has to be monitored and the film team has to carry oxygen.
¿Ellos son visitados?
Sí.
ALMA is a state-of-the-art telescope that studies light from the darkest depths of our universe. The telescope consists of 66 high-precision antennae spread over 16 kilometers. ALMA is the world's most powerful telescope for observing molecular gas and dust, the essential components of stars, planets, and galaxies.
From the engineering side, of course, ALMA is incredible. We have 66 antennas that are working together. There were a lot of problems at the beginning to do with the altitude as well. There's snowstorms, there's high winds. So in terms of engineering, it's a huge feat. But for me, really what's spectacular up there is probably the natural landscape. There's nothing growing at 5,000 meters, right? It's really like being on another planet. You have trouble breathing at the beginning, so you have to get used to the altitude. It's really just an experience that's completely outside of your comfort zone or your normal environment.
Few places on Earth resemble Mars or the Moon as much as the geography surrounding the ALMA telescope.
It was always in the back of my mind that I would like to be an astronaut, but it's not something you actively pursue, right? You have to wait for a position to be advertised, basically. So in, I think it was 2008, I saw an advert that ESA, the European Space Agency, that they were looking for a new generation of astronauts. I had just moved to Munich. I had just finished my PhD a couple of years before, so I didn't have very much work experience, but I decided anyway I would apply because these kind of job advertisements come out every 15 years or so. So it was really a unique opportunity. And I applied. Unfortunately, I didn't get very far because basically I was very naive. I just didn't prepare myself. I made it to the first round, which only 10% of people made it into at all. So, I mean, that was already an achievement. But rather than say, okay, I'm going to give it my best shot, I just kind of thought, oh, it's like an intelligence test. I can't really do much. And I'll just see. And then, of course, I flunked the tests completely. So I really berated myself for many, many years. I was really upset with myself that I just threw away that chance, really. In 2016, I saw this advert on Spiegel Online, which is one of the big German online newspapers that I tend to read. I saw, oh, they're looking for the first female German astronaut. And I was like, wow, okay, cool. Yeah, I might have a chance. And I thought, well, even if I don't, it doesn't matter. I've, been so upset. I was so upset with myself for screwing up last time. I just have to go for it. So in the end, I sent in my application.
Die Astronautin GmbH ist ein Raumfahrt-Startup, das einzige Raumfahrt-Startup, das sich...
The Astronautin is the only space startup in Europe focusing on astronaut missions and marketing space flights. When I saw the 1969 moon landing on TV, I knew I wanted to be an astronaut. I'd never have thought that 50 years later there would still be no German woman in space. I've spoken to many politicians and heads of space agencies, and they all agreed. But they said they couldn't do anything because there were no women in Germany trained for this. In the last ESA selection in 2009, no German women were among the final candidates. But remember that the selection criteria was set by men. The selection committee and documents were very strongly male-dominated. I listened to all that for a while. At the time, I was managing director of a personnel agency for aerospace engineers. Finally, I'd had enough of that conversation. So I took things in hand myself and posted a job for the first female German astronaut.
After a while, they said, oh, OK, you made it through the first round. We'd like to actually meet you. You have to fill in all these preliminary forms. And then after, I think about 6 months after I'd applied, I then went for the first series of tests for the astronaut selection. And these were really quite tough tests. I had a bit of an advantage maybe because I knew what was coming, because I had been to those tests in 2008. So I knew, or this time basically I swore to myself, OK, I'm going to do whatever I can. And if I don't make it, if I'm not smart enough or whatever, fine. But I'm actually going to give it my best shot this time. So I really prepared. So there's all kinds of different questions. This ranges from basic English, which for me was quite easy. So you have to do an English test. Then you do maths test, basic physics questions. Then there are all kinds of just general cognitive tests. We had tests for spatial awareness. Those were actually, for me, among the most difficult ones. So you had to do things like you had a die, and there'd be a cross on one side of the die, and there'd be nothing else on any of the other sides. And then this was all acoustic. So you'd hear, okay, the cross is at the top, and then there is a sequence of movements. So they'd say forward, forward, back, left, right, forward, back. Where is the cross now? That was something that I had actually in the tests in 2008, and that I just was completely, I'm absolutely sure that's one of the reasons I didn't make it to the next round. Basically, I completely flunked out on that one. I was just like, I had no idea. But it's actually something you can train very well. So what I did for like 3 weeks before this test, I actually trained this. I made myself my own exercises, right, and worked out where the cross should be, recorded them to myself, and then just practiced this ad nauseam, and it helped. So, all of these things can be trained. And after this first round, it went down to 30. So 1 in 3 people made it through. But then the second round, it was a bit more subtle. The second round was more psychological. It was really psychological tests. So they had a bunch of psychologists interviewing you. Then you had teamwork exercises. There'd be these exercises where a conflict would be artificially generated, and they wanted to see how you respond to the conflict. And actually, after that round, I was completely convinced that I had screwed up completely. I threw away all my application materials because I was convinced that was it. I was out. I didn't want a reminder of this at all. And I just went to bed and I was like, okay, fine. And then 2 days later, they were like, oh, you made it to the next round. I'm like, what? So my first reaction was like, there's been a mistake. But then I thought I'd be stupid to point out the mistake, right? So I just, sorry, okay, if that's what you think, fine. So the first thing I ran down to the cellar to get all the application materials because they had all kinds of codes for the medical tests and whatever they were supposed to keep, right? And I was really lucky that the rubbish hadn't been taken out basically yet. And I managed to retrieve from under piles of other people's rubbish. But luckily it was only the waste paper, right? So it wasn't that disgusting. I managed to retrieve my application details. There were 8 that were selected after those psychological tests. So from 30 it went down to 8 after the psychological tests. What came after that was the medical tests. So basically they just test, every part of your body. There was a very strong focus on the eyes, So we had about half a day of eye tests, all kinds of things, night vision and peripheral vision and all kinds of things. But basically, they just test that you're healthy. And then after these medical tests, which lasted 3 days, there were six out of the 8 made it through the medical tests, and those were the finalists that were then kind of presented to the public.
Ich darf nach vorne bitten. Und hier sehen Sie es, Frau Nicola Baumann. So, das sind die beiden. Und ich kann sagen, wir Deutsche dürfen stolz auf diese beiden Personen sein. Ich bitte um Applaus.
To come so close and to have invested so much and then to have it snatched away from you is, really difficult. It was one of the worst days of my life, but it was definitely, I think, one of the most difficult days. But not so much the day, it was the entire period that followed, I think, because also I was very much a little bit deflated because I thought, okay, I've put so much into this and, a lot of my also planning for the future had been put on hold because I was fully invested in this whole selection process. And then all of a sudden I was like, okay, I'm back to, the old thing and where am I really going with my job? But of course I was like, okay, wow, yeah. So I'm here, I'm back where I started after a year of intensive preparation. What am I gonna do now? So actually I talked to my boss, who's fantastic. He was very understanding throughout the whole thing. And I said, look, we have these partners in Japan. And I was rolling out this new software, this Aqua, around the globe, basically. So I said, look, maybe it would work if I go to Japan for a couple of months, get to know my Japanese colleagues better, help them with the software, and for me personally, just get away from Germany and from all the media and from everybody asking me questions. So luckily he agreed. He thought it was going to be also good for the department, for my professional development, which in the end it was. So he let me go to Japan, basically. And I was away for 2.5 months, basically just to get away from things, get new ideas into my mind, just see different people, have nobody know about the astronaut thing, basically. So I basically just escaped, I think. That was the main thing. And then ironically, the way it is sometimes, just as I'd got to Japan, I'd been in Japan for a couple of weeks, I'd started, forgetting about it. It was so exciting being in Japan, it was different foods, I couldn't understand anything. So I had loads of other things on my mind. And that's when